Time to, if we've got a couple of slides, oh, we're live. Sorry.
Yeah. Good evening, everyone. My name is Nishita Biswas, and I'm an undergraduate student currently pursuing English honors in Rani Billa Girls College, Kolkata. I welcome you to the stories of tribal identity and culture that will explore the role of cross culturalization of tribal communities in shaping cultural identity and ideology, curated under TMYS Review December 2024 in collaboration with the Center for Asia Pacific Initiative, University of Victoria. We are also calling for submission of essays, poems, and short stories under the project. To know more about the submission guidelines and the project architecture, please visit www.tellmeyourstory.biz. This evening, I consider myself very privileged to be in the company of our esteemed panelists, Dr. Tessa Minter, Dr. Miri Raven, and Dr. Aasish Khaka, who will shortly share their views and insights with us. The topic for today's discussion is the role of literary and artistic translation in cross culturalization. Before, before we begin, I'd like to introduce our speakers. Our first speaker for the session is Dr. Tessa Minter. Dr. Tessa Minter is an assistant professor at an Institute of Cultural Anthropology and Development Sociology. In her research, she focuses in her research and teaching, she focuses on environmental anthropology with specific interest in livelihood strategies of forest dependent and coastal people in the Asia Pacific region and their adaptation to social and environmental change. Her research assesses under what circumstances I'm extremely sorry. Her research assesses under what circumstances environmental exploitation and protection benefit or harm rural people's well-being. She particularly studies forest-dependent and coastal people's livelihood, strategies, and their relationships with logging, mining, and conservation activities in the Philippines and the Solomon Islands. Through her work, she aims to contribute greater environmental justice. We are delighted to have you in the panel with us, Dr. Minter. Thank you for joining.
Thank you so much, Nishita. Do you want me to start right away, or are you going to introduce the other
No, ma'am.
speakers first?
We are going to introduce you first.
Okay. Thank you very much for your very kind introduction and also for your kind invitation to join. I'm really delighted to join you tonight. I guess it's tonight for most people. Sorry, I have to get rid of a
Yeah.
message here. So in my approximately 10 minutes talk, I will highlight the importance of taking a
Excuse
gendered,
me, ma'am.
yes,
We will introduce the other speakers and then we'll proceed with the discussion. It's all
sure.
right. Okay. Introducing our next speaker of the session is Dr. Miri Raven. Dr. Miri Raven is a geographer with research interest on indigenous food stories, protocol, policies, and the role of indigenous knowledges in biodiversity conservation. Her current research explores protocol in the context of indigenous food security and the household level, and the implementation of biodiversity conservation legislation, COVID 19, and Indigenous people and Aboriginal culture, resilience and health and well being in NSW. She is undertaking some of this research as a co chief investigator along with Professor Daniel Robinson on the ARC Discovery Project, Indigenous Knowledge Futures, Protecting and Promoting Indigenous Knowledge. It's a pleasure to have you with us this evening, Dr. Raven. Thank you for joining us. Our next speaker for the session is Dr. Aasish Khaka. Dr. Aasish Khaka is an assistant professor of sociology, Adivasi, indigenous people, and development studies in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at IIT Gandhinagar. He obtained his PhD in the Development Studies of the Tata Institute of Social Sciences (TISS), Mumbai in 2021, where he was an ICSSR doctoral fellow. His broader research is on the urbanization and changing cityscapes of India, focusing on the unexplored aspects of equity, governance, and social justice. His PhD examined the development of tribes or indigenous people of the central and northeast India with specific reference to urbanization, constitutional and legal provisions, development issues, land tenure systems, local governance and democracy, alienation and deprivation from a comparative perspective. A warm welcome to you, Dr. Zaza. Thank you for joining us this evening. I'm really sorry if I mispronounce your name at times.
That's okay, thank you.
We will now open the forum for discussion. I would like to request Dr. Minter to share her insights. Ma'am, over to you now.
Thank you, and apologies for my previous interruption. I couldn't hear you properly. So once
It's all
again,
right, ma'am.
thank you so much for inviting me tonight and for being part of this really interesting session. So in my 10 minutes talk approximately, I would like to highlight the importance of taking a gendered perspective for a proper understanding of how Indigenous knowledge systems are important for equitable and sustainable development and resource management. And I will illustrate this point by sharing with you a story from Solomon Islands. So this archipelago of over 1,000 islands is situated in the Pacific Ocean and is home to roughly 750,000 people. The great majority of Solomon Islanders today live in rural areas where they mostly subsist on small-scale fisheries and agriculture. Road infrastructure is very limited and of poor quality, and most transportation takes place with irregular ferry services that connect the various islands with small urban centers and the capital city. And that capital city is Honiara, and that is home to only 85,000 inhabitants. Since the 1980s, the country has been opened up to foreign investment and to the logging industry in particular. Few people know that this small country is one of the main tropical hardwood suppliers in the world. Logging businesses are foreign-owned, but are highly dependent on brokerage by Solomon Islanders license holders who have to negotiate forest access and exploitation with land-owning clans. This is what makes Solomon Islands a special case compared to most other tropical hardwood exporters. By law, 85% of all land is collectively owned. And this is also different in that most tropical hardwood exporters are usually doing that on state-owned land. So that is not the case in Solomon Islands. Once forest exploitation is successful, 60% of the log export value goes to the company and so out of the country. 25% goes to the central government of Solomon Islands, and the remaining 15% is divided between the license holder and land-owning clans, whose populations vary between hundreds to thousands individuals. I worked in Solomon Islands between 2015 and 19, at which time, together with its bigger neighbor Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands produced half of all China's tropical hardwood imports, which was then the largest importer and exporter of tropical hardwoods. This is just to say that Solomon Islands, small as it may be, is really a major player in tropical hardwood production and export. My work took place on the island of Malaita, the most densely populated island of the country and home to about 25% of the national population. I took in my work a political ecology perspective, perhaps even a feminist political ecology perspective, and focused on how the burdens and benefits of the logging industry were locally distributed. Now, today, I will focus specifically on how logging operations on Malaita affect marine fisheries and indigenous knowledge systems surrounding marine fisheries. In particular, this is a story about women's fishing grounds in mangrove areas, which are important for the collection of shells. Fresh fish and fresh shells are major components of local diets on Solomon Islands, and they are, in fact, the #1 source of animal protein. However, during interviews that I did with 39 women and 39 men on the island of Malaita, a whole range of negative impacts of logging on fisheries came to the front. About 98% of all my respondents talked about these negative impacts. But interestingly, men and women both emphasized different types of impact. While men emphasized a decline in reef resources, women emphasized a decline in mangrove and freshwater resources. And this is not at all surprising because men indeed predominantly fish on coral reefs, while women's main fishing grounds consist of mangrove forests and indeed river mouths. It is in these locations that many women describe to me how they used to manually collect shells and crabs for their daily family meals, but also as late afternoon snacks, and they describe this as their happy hour. But at the same time, women consistently mention to me that since logging operations begun, they see a thick and hard layer of sediment sitting on top of the mangrove roots and mud flats. The combination of logging road construction, oil spills by logging machinery, and heavy rainfall throughout the year generates runoff that causes sedimentation of mudflats. When I joined women on shell collection trips in these mangrove forests, I could clearly see why this was a problem. One of the main shells that women collect are aptly called disco shells. And the reason they are given this name is that women collect them by sinking their bare feet and underlegs deep into the soft mangrove mud and wiggling their feet to loosen up the shells. But in mangrove areas that are affected by logging activity, this soft mud is now covered by a thick, hard layer of sediment, which suffocates the shells, making them die. As a result, women now have a hard time collecting disco shells, which directly affects their families' diets. As one female school teacher summarized the situation, our happy hour became a hungry hour. Now, aside from this sedimentation problem, women's fishing grounds are also affected by an even more impactful problem caused by the logging industry, the complete removal of mangrove forests. And this is not because mangroves in themselves are commercially interesting, but because of the need to pile up the logs that come from the tropical rainforest uphill before they are loaded onto ships for export. These so-called log ponds, the place where all logs are awaiting shipment, are very often created by removing mangrove forests. And on the island of Malaita alone, we counted over 40 of such log ponds created in mangrove forests. This not only has direct dietary, but also emotional and relational consequences, as Mrs. Sikolastika Okapizi, an elderly woman and mother of 11 children from the village of Mararo, explained to me. She said, "It's a big concern for me that the mangroves have gone, because it is where I found food. When my children were small, I would go there to find food for all of them. It was close by, so when I heard them cry, I could just go back quickly. The mangroves also gave the last food to my husband when he was dying. When he was crying for oropio, a mangrove worm, I just went there to collect it for him. So when I saw the machines landing, the logging machines, I felt as if I saw my mother dying. The happiness, the food, and the help that the place gave me is now gone. I want this to be told because it makes me cry." Not only for Mrs. Sikolastika, but for many other inhabitants of Mararo, a small village on the east coast of Malaita, the arrival of the logging machines on their doorstep came as an unpleasant surprise. This was particularly true, however, for the women who had not been involved in the decision-making process, leave alone the negotiation process between their clan elders, the license holder, and the logging company. Had they been involved, their intimate knowledge of the mangrove forests and fisheries systems could have been taken into account and might have resulted in different decisions. For example, in a different location of the log pond, which could have spared Mrs. Sikolastika's fishing ground. Perhaps also the inclusion of women's voices and knowledge might have led to the overall rejection of the logging operation and more sustainable and equitable forms of development. This example from a Pacific island is just one of many that demonstrates, in my perspective, the need for a gendered lens on Indigenous knowledge systems and their consequences for sustainable development. And that's the story I wanted to share with you. I hope I remained within time. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your insightful observations, Dr. Mentor. Moving forward, the stage is open for Dr. Raven. Ma'am, over to you. Ma'am, you're muted. If you can unmute yourself.
Sorry, I'm just trying to share a screen. I have to choose a screen to share, sorry. It's not letting me choose. Is it allowing me to share a screen?
Ma'am, we were just able to see your screen. We can see your screen.
This is not the screen I want to share, unfortunately. It's something else. I'll just have to go without my images. Maybe I can show them during the when I get asked questions. So I had some images to show. So I just want to start by saying that I am an Aboriginal person from southwestern of Western Australia. My mother's Aboriginal, my father's from Aotearoa, New Zealand. I'd like to acknowledge that I work on Bidjigal and Gadigal country in New South Wales in Australia. I now live and work here. I've been here for about 10 years. I'd also like to acknowledge that I work with many Indigenous peoples in Vanuatu, the Cook Islands, and Australia. So I'm Noongar by descent through my mother, but also culturally Yamaji. We've always known that we're Aboriginal because the state, supported by religious institutions, took our children away and placed us in institutions. As part of the breeding program to make us white or civilised, I grew up on Yamaji country, and so did a huge branch of my family. And for a long time, I identified as Yamaji. Although I knew that I was Noongar, but a chance discussion with someone from my family told me that I actually come from the southwest of Western Australia. But this took many years to realise. And in Western Australia, there's this kind of ongoing, it's not a conflict, but it's kind of more like a discussion between Noongar and Yamaji, the same way that you would have a discussion between two sports teams. One's better than the other or not better than the other. So Noongar country is, so I start with those protocols because they're important in Australia. They're important as an Indigenous person to place where you are, but also so other people can place where you are. But I also start with protocols because it's the area that I work in. And I think that they're important for biodiversity conservation and for caring for country. Country is the word that we use in Australia to refer to land and earth. And we use that word because earth has so many connotations with it, and so does land. It's viewed in a way that Indigenous people don't necessarily agree with. So Noongar country is now constituted by 6 settlements or tribal settlements under a single Noongar claim. I belong to 3 of those. The southwest of Western Australia is also a biodiversity hotspot. So the entire southwest is classified as a biodiversity hotspot. This is an area of land that's been under care for many hundreds of thousands of years by Noongar people, which is probably one of the reasons it's been considered a biodiversity hotspot, because we cared for it for so long. In my undergraduate years studying geography, I saw the ecological devastation that the wheat and sheep farming does to Australian soils and the water table. During the early stages of colonisation, which Crosby calls ecological colonialism, huge areas of land was cleared to plant wheat and sheep for grazing. This area is known as the wheat belt, and you can see it in aerial photos. So if you look on the map, on an aerial photo of Western Australia, there's an entire area which is cleared of vegetation for the most part. It wasn't known in the early days of colonisation that many of the Australian trees, like eucalypts, have deep tap roots. They keep the water table low. Removing the native perennial deep-rooted trees and replacing it with short-rooted annual vegetation caused the water table to rise and brought salt water to the surface. So this created a thing called dryland salinity or secondary soil salinity. I remember thinking back then how ludicrous it was that we continued to use plants and animals in environments that were not suited to hooved animals and annual vegetation that were not climatically suited to country. But I guess global commodity markets are hard to escape from. In Australia, aside from mining, agricultural production uses a lot of land. So this is from Ag WA, Ag Australia. The Australian agricultural sector accounts for 55% of Australian land use, 74% of water consumption, 13.6% of goods and services exported in 2002 and 2023. And it adds 2.7% to the gross domestic product and 2.2% of employment. I would expect if it uses 55% of the land, it would probably, I would hope that it would contribute a higher amount of GDP. But in the 1990s, start asking, why aren't we using Australian edible plant species as the basis for Australian agriculture? Any form of agriculture based on edible plant species in Australia will be based on Indigenous knowledge. There are countless books and journal articles dating back to the 1800s documenting traditional use. This intellectual property, I don't like that term, but I use it, belongs to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. It's our knowledge and heritage, and it's stated so in the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. But it's problematic to use Indigenous knowledge, and it's problematic because when Indigenous knowledge is used outside of the context in which was originally came to be known, it enters into an economic system and it creates a lot of money and a lot of wealth. But what's happening in this country and in lots of other places in the world are Indigenous people are left out of this. So essentially, our heritage, our cultural heritage, our intellectual property is being utilised by non-Indigenous peoples to create products in the market, whether they be products like skincare products, or whether it just being some type of additive to foods, or we hope, or some of us hope, it may become a major commodity. I don't like the idea of an Indigenous food product becoming a major commodity because I don't think we should commercialise a plant which is essentially our brother and our sister. But I think it's better than using wheat and sheep. It's much better for country. When you go down the path of using Indigenous knowledge, you have to grapple with ethics and equity. In the world of global biodiversity, this is about access and benefit sharing, or ABS. So while biotrade is not included in the Nagoya Protocol to the Convention on Biodiversity, there are places like South Africa who have included it. So some countries are saying, when we take Indigenous knowledge and we create a product out of them, whether it be a commercial product for research and development or whether it be for biotrade. So biotrade's a fancy name of saying trading a biological resource. We need to take into account sharing the benefits from that access. And that benefit sharing can be monetary or non-monetary. It can be in the form of providing one-off gratia payment. It could also be creating an intellectual property right that Indigenous peoples are co-owners of or own outright. It could be technological transfer, so ensuring that Indigenous peoples have access to laboratories or training so that they can value add their own products. The other part of this which is what I'm interested in as well, is the use of protocols. So the Nagoya Protocol to the Convention on Biodiversity under Article 12 makes specific provisions for parties to support Indigenous peoples to create protocols. That's not the actual wording, that's just a short form of what the clause actually says. Essentially what it means is that Indigenous communities and peoples have their own existing cultural law and practices, and these are kind of called protocols in a short form. Their rules, their obligations, their ways of interacting with each other, including plants and animals and everything else in country and the ocean and water sources. The work that I do with my colleague, Professor Daniel Robinson, in Australia, Vanuatu and Cook Islands, is to work directly with Indigenous peoples, to sit down with them and say, what do you want people to know about how they can access your knowledge? We've got, COVID has been a huge dampener on our research, particularly in Vanuatu and the Cook Islands. We're in the process of finalising quite a few of them. We have one in Nusametu, in Tanna, with Nusametu, and it's essentially a sign that's put up outside a protected area. That was negotiated over 2 years. It's very straightforward. It has rules like you can't access this area without talking to the traditional chief. You can't take the protected bird, and any other rule that is associated with that particular area. The other protocol that we've negotiated and is finalised is one in the Cook Islands on Aitutaki with a group of traditional healers. Protocols don't have to look like something in particular. They can look like anything. They can be a sign, they can be a story, they can be a song. And they don't necessarily apply to the same things. So the Cook Islands Aitutaki Traditional Healers Network is both in Cook Island Māori and also in English. And it works essentially for a group of traditional healers. And this group of traditional healers hold knowledge in a very different way to the way that Aboriginal people hold knowledge in Australia. Our knowledge, while we do have people who have specific knowledge about plants, it tends to be shared a bit more broadly. In Aitutaki, traditional healers hold their own traditional knowledge to themselves. They may not even share it within their community, but the group of traditional healers want to be able to maintain their practice of traditional medicines. And they want to be able to do it together in a way that means that they're not divulging information but supporting each other. So they put together a traditional healers protocol, and they're in the process of working out how will they work with the actual government in the Cook Islands. Both Vanuatu and the Cook Islands, Vanuatu more so than the Cook Islands, are looking at ways of having these protocols recognised in legislation. So Vanuatu has a Traditional Knowledge Act, and we've worked with the government there. These protocols, we hope, will be recognised in the future under law. So if an outsider, particularly in Vanuatu, if they're in Tanna, if they arrive in Tanna and then they make their way out to Nusametu or one of the other islands, if people don't follow those protocols and they take the knowledge and they take samples and they take Indigenous knowledge, they could face some type of ramification under the legislation in Vanuatu. We don't know what that will be because it's such a new process. But the hope is that these protocols will have some type of legal standing. We're not that far in Australia yet. We are actually a long way behind. I will leave it there, and so we can have more time for questions. Thank you. I'm sorry about the pictures.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for your invaluable perspectives. And I'm really sorry that you couldn't present what you had initially planned. Our next speaker is Dr. Aasish Khaka. Sir, over to you.
Thank you, Nishita, for your kind invitation and introduction. I'll try to present. Let me see if it's working. Is it coming? Can you see the PPT?
No, sir. We can't see it.
Okay. Okay, maybe I'll try again. If it's not working, then I'll just speak. I don't think it's working for me either. But anyways, I'll just speak what I had to say. Thank you so much Nishita, and I'm very. I would like to begin by saying that I'm very moved by what Dr. Minter and Dr. Raven have shared. I think it speaks to my own work. Um, I'm an Adivasi by birth, and I primarily work on the emerging urban areas in India, particularly in central and in northeast India. Now, why this research is intriguing to me, because for a long time, indigenous land has been viewed as a sort of a part of a rural land and a sort of an agricultural land, not necessarily connected to urban spaces. But ever since the colonial period, and more so in the post-colonial phase, in the garb of development, we have seen the state come in and really sort of try to push the state agenda of mining, development, extractive industries, so on and so forth. And we've had a ever since 1947, since India got independence, we've had a large scale displacement of Adivasis from these areas. If you look at the data itself, the largest number of displaced people within India will be the Adivasis, who have been displaced because of several development projects across the length and breadth of this country. Now, what I wanted to now in that context, it becomes intriguing for me to study urban spaces, because my own PhD work was on understanding how does two new capital townships have come up, a one in central India, one in northeast India. And the reason why I wanted to sort of touch upon this topic of sustainability is that one, the government of India does not recognize tribal people as as indigenous people, although it is a signatory to the UN Declaration of the Rights um, of in of Adivasis. Now, as per the 2011 census, Adivasis are around 104 million people, and they constitute of about 8.6% of the total population of the country. We've not had a census after that. I'm sure if we have a current census, the number will go up for sure. Um, Now, why I want to focus on this topic is that there are two ways in which Adivasis have um, regulated their lives with what exists. If you look at the symbiotic relationship between the indigenous people in India, and of what we call as nature and the environment, a lot of that can be traced back to their oral stories, to their oral myths, the idea of the creation of the Great Spirit, one which remains as existential, and the other which is a more of a ritual and a symbolic idea. So tribes have primarily lived off the land and forest, and they depend exclusively on the forest for their livelihood. So primarily, if you look at the kind of agriculture that is practiced in India, one is settled agriculture, and the other is shifting cultivation. Um, Shifting cultivation is more prevalent in northeast India, and settled agriculture is more dominant in what we can call as central India or as mainland India. Um, uh, in mainland India, the more prevalent form of agriculture is the same as the one practiced by the non-tribal population. The only difference is that tribes even then depend on the forest for a large part of of their needs. Now, besides food, tribes are also dependent on forest for materials required for making their huts, houses, as well as for making tools, implements required for their routine economic and household activities. The use of bamboo and timber as poles and frames are considered in the construction of their houses. And their dependence on the forest is also evident from making tools and implements for their daily use. Hunting implements such as bows and arrows, slings, spears, swords are also made from forest products. Fishing tools, and even I have seen a couple of waterproof coats, which are made from the leaves from leaves. So apart from food and other such um, uh, items, the other use of nature is that of what we can see in the medicinal domain. So knowledge of the treatment, of treating diseases is another sphere where we find a close relation between tribal communities and their and their environment. To just to give an example, among the Orao community from where I come from, there are about 34 kinds of diseases which can be treated with such medicines. So they include remedies for pain, be it headache, toothaches, stomach ache, eye pain, migraine, fever wounds, constipation, diarrhea, dysentery, epilepsy, in insomnia, tetanus, so on and so forth. More recent studies have also highlighted the fact that in Odisha and Madhya Pradesh, which are two separate states, there are around 40 trees and more than 50 herbs which have been used for medicine purposes. Another study which has shown that in the state of Kerala, there are at least 39 species of roots, 15 fruits, 30 of leaves, 12 of bark, which are used in these medicinal purposes. And why does the relationship with the environment become so crucial is that the purpose behind having rituals observed during these festivals and the rites of passage is to renew this relationship between the creator and the creation, and to promote and to preserve it through this very syncretic and symbolic repetition. um, During such occasions, Adivasi communities stop everything that they have done, and they sort of take out a time to review and to re-evaluate their situation, and after having been reassured, they move on further. Now, this is something that leads me to another aspect of having of growing the aspect of an ethical environmental concern. Um, Indigenous communities in India, they do not depend on a single mode which leads to the over exploitation of the given resource. And even while they are engaged in an economic activity, their objective is mostly sustenance and not accumulation. So the idea is that so in the idea what I'm trying to say is that the idea of accumulation, of what Marx calls as primitive accumulation, is an alien concept to the Adivasis. If this has been their value, they could have reclaimed or enclosed large areas for themselves, because nothing would have stopped them from doing this, as the forest's resources was a gift of creation, was in abundance. Now, this leads to an ethical idea where you have equity on one hand and sustainability on the other hand. Coming to today's topic, the idea of how can you have equity and sustainability on both sides. So primarily, what we find is that egalitarianism has been a sort of a driving force of social life within Adivasi and tribal societies. So, what I want to conclude with is that the bonds between what indigenous communities and the earth is not just that of the material aspect, but also a moral and a ritual relationship that they have. Now, land is valuable to tribes because it not just provides them a source of livelihood, but it is also a memory of their ancestors. So this memory is very important for them. The idea of memory, that okay, this piece of land has been given to us by our ancestors. We should not exploit it, but we have it is a moral binding upon them to preserve and hand it over to their descendants. And this uh, this philosophy is what is in polar opposite to what state modernity demands in the name of development, like exploit, extract, keep pushing the gross domestic produce forward and forward without really caring about the future. And I think that this is a philosophy that needs to be safeguarded, championed, as well as, this is one philosophy that can challenge uh, the very positivist idea of what the state really wants to move forward. And I think in the era of what we are facing in global warming and of climate change, it becomes more and more imperative to listen to indigenous people's voices when we are trying to understand as to how can we deal with all the kind of crises, the sort of large scale crises that that we seem to be dealing with at this point. And I think if we tap into the sustainability aspect, if we tap into the ethical aspect of the philosophy, I think we can find a way as to how can we both preserve the cultural heritage as well as address the core issue of sustainable development. So with that, I will end my presentation here, and thank you so much for it. I'll be happy to take questions.
Thank you for your vital observations, Dr. Khaka. So, moving onwards, we will now move on to the question and answer session. My first question is to Dr. Mentor. Ma'am, how do systems like Indigenous knowledge system help in maintaining a balance between resource use and conservation?
Thank you, Nishita. And thank you to the other two speakers too for enlightening us with very, very moving indeed stories and insights. I feel to share with you that I'm a non-Indigenous person. I'm from the Netherlands, and I've been very privileged to have worked with Indigenous peoples for the past 25 years. Acknowledging also that it is definitely not self-evident for them to open up their houses and hearts to somebody from a very different place. So I'm very grateful for that. As to your question, Nishita, I think as the example of the shells in the mangrove forest in Solomon Islands shows, it's by learning from Indigenous knowledge systems that we actually see how intricate these ecological systems are, right? And the people that I work with in Solomon Islands directly depend on these systems. And of course, that is not a rarity. So as we've heard in the other talks as well, Indigenous peoples all over the world, but in fact, everyone in this world depends on ecological systems and the integrity of these systems to thrive and survive. And what the example of the shells to me at least shows is that if we change one aspect of these systems and we don't take care of what we change and we don't look forward of how that change may be cascading a whole range of other changes, we might as well lose that system altogether. And you might see that as a very instrumental way of looking at Indigenous knowledge systems, right? So in order to maintain the productivity of an ecological system, we need to take that Indigenous knowledge into account. And that is, I think, at the core of your question, how does it have consequences for conservation? But I would really like to highlight that it's not just about that, right? It's the food security of the people who directly depend on these systems themselves that is really at stake. So yeah, in short, by understanding Indigenous knowledge systems, we learn so much about how these ecological systems function. And we need that knowledge simply for them and for the benefit of the world. I hope that answers your question somehow.
Yes, it absolutely does. My next question is to Dr. Raven. Ma'am, based on your area of expertise, what are the challenges that you have witnessed the communities facing in maintenance of their cultural heritage?
I think there's a couple of challenges. One of the biggest challenges is brought about because of colonisation. So a lot of Indigenous people in Australia in particular have been removed from country, and we are struggling to find our way back home, so to speak. So find our way back to country, to live on and with country, and to reinvigorate our knowledge systems. So while we still have traditional elders who have a lot of knowledge, not everyone does. And so there's a couple of things around that, which is like getting people, Aboriginal people, back in contact with those traditional elders and going out on country. And going out on country means you have to have access to that land. And some people just can't get access to that country because it's locked up in pastoral leases or there's mining activities on their country. So that's one big part of that. My colleague Ari and I and a group of about 12 researchers have a National Health and Medical Research Council grant working on cultural health in the north of New South Wales with Gimilaroi and Nurralaway, and on the southwest coast of, this is in New South Wales, sorry, on the southwest coast with Yuin Mob. And part of that project is to hold these cultural camps, to take Indigenous people who may have some knowledge or no knowledge and go back out on country and relearn the knowledge that is their birthright. So that's one aspect. The other challenge is for a very long time, Indigenous knowledge was considered irrelevant, and it's not anymore. People are waking up to the fact that it's quite a valuable asset, and it's being used increasingly by non-Indigenous people to create products. And like it may not seem like it's locking people out of experiencing their cultural heritage, but once you start locking up Indigenous knowledge into intellectual property rights and creating products out of them, Indigenous people themselves can't create can't create money off their own knowledge, because intellectual property rights means that they can't use it. So there are examples in Australia of some companies claiming intellectual property rights on a plant and then writing deceased and desist letters to Indigenous people saying you cannot use this knowledge anymore, you can't use the name. So that's one aspect. And the other is what happens to a plant when it becomes a commodity? How do we maintain some type of cultural connection to it? I'm not averse to using Indigenous knowledge to create a commodity. I really don't think we should have wheat in Australia. I don't think it should be a commodity for Australia, and I think that we can create another alternative. We have an amazing amount of grains here that are high in protein that could be the next commodity. But what does that mean for Indigenous peoples? Like, how do we then relate to that particular plant, knowing that we've now included it into a system that probably is not in the benefit of the plant itself? So there's a whole lot of different challenges that go on around maintaining cultural heritage practices. And it also depends on where you live. If you live in a city and you're like, so if you live in Sydney, in the centre of Sydney, and you're Gadigal and that's your country, how do you maintain cultural practices when there are high rises and really large subdivisions across your land? There's only small pockets of land left in Sydney where you can go and do that. And some of the practices are cultural burning. Like no one's going to let you set a light to a park in Sydney because you want to maintain your cultural heritage practice. So there's all of these kind of difficulties around maintaining cultural heritage practices, particularly if you live in areas like cities or regional and urban centres, which is your traditional country.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for your answer. My next question is to Dr. Kaka. So, what, in your opinion, are the key cultural and social components of Indigenous knowledge systems that are crucial for tribal sustainability?
Thanks, Nishita. I think um, we need to observe the rites and passages and rituals um, of Adivasis in order to understand. If you talk purely from an anthropological point of view, what are the codes and modes and cultures that they, what are they ascribing to or subscribing to? But if you move beyond the anthropological lens, and if you really start, getting into the lived experience part of them, as I had mentioned, it starts to talk of a deeper connection with the land. It starts to talk to their own oral histories, their own oral narratives, that who can, what does the land mean to them? It is not just a piece of geography. It is not just a piece of, you know, either forest or trees or whatever. The idea is that well, this land was given to us as a gift from our elders who got it, who it was further, if you take it back, it was given to them by the, by the creator. And the idea is that I really like this Native American proverb. I'm not getting the actual text, but it says that the land does not belong to the parents, but the land actually belongs to the children. The idea is that uh, you know you don't inherit the earth, for yourself. You inherit the earth for your kids, and once you are gone, what will the kids inherit from you? So all their practices, all their cultural practices, be it food, medicine, economic activities, these are manifestations of their own cultural beliefs. So I would say that if you pay attention to that, I think we can tap into what consists of the epistemic framework of indigenous knowledge, and I think that can give us the idea of the bedrock of their culture.
Thank you for your answer, sir. Moving on to the second round of questions, I would like to come back to Dr. Minter. Ma'am, what inspired your involvement in the promotion of Indigenous well-being and preservation against environmental exploitation?
Yeah, that's a good question, which makes me go back in my memory to when this actually started, which is over 25 years ago. And it was a different time then. Like Miri Raven was also mentioning, right now we see, fortunately, a greater acknowledgement of the importance of Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous rights, also acknowledgement of the great injustices that have taken place in the past and still continue today. And when I started this work as an undergraduate student, like yourself now, I believe, this was not yet the case. And there was, of course, in the locations where this is all about, there was a lot of acknowledgement of all these injustices. And there was also a need to make those stories known to the world. And so I was really inspired by that need, it's very, and I continue to be inspired now by the fact that so many of these Indigenous communities have actually found ways to have their identity acknowledged by their governments, even if it's not perfect, far from perfect. But for example, the Indigenous community where I did my PhD research in the Philippines, they call themselves ACTA, which means person. They have faced a long history of oppression, marginalization, discrimination, etc. And what we see now is that they actually start to take pride in their identity for the first time. And this is being taken up by NGOs, by government as well. So over the past 25 years, I have witnessed sort of a shift in the acknowledgement of cultural identity, Indigenous identity, which I find very encouraging, which is not to say that there isn't still a whole lot of work to be done. And as we also know, and we were talking about Nagoya Protocol earlier, having all these things on paper and even in international law doesn't mean that it is implemented, doesn't mean that these things are actually happening. But there's so many initiatives going on right now that really go into the right direction. So that's where I continue to get my inspiration from.
All right, thank you, ma'am. It was really great to know about where you have started all this journey. And moving on to Dr. Raven, ma'am, my second question to you is, how do the knowledge systems help in maintaining ecological balance and resource conservation across various regions?
I think, well, it's spatially differentiated. So by saying that, I mean it's not the same everywhere, and that's a stock standard answer you'll get from a geographer. It's different depending upon where you go. It depends on the level and the impact of colonization. So some places like Vanuatu and the Cook Islands, while there was colonization, they still maintained a very strong system of traditional governance, and they are included in law. And so the Cook Islands has two systems of government. It has a traditional form of government through the House of Arikis, and I forget the terminology. Sorry, it's late here in Australia, so my brain's beginning to wind down. It's 10:30. And in Vanuatu, they still each, and Vanuatu's got islands, so a lot of the cultural heritage, the ecological sustainable development is done on the basis of an island tribal council. In Australia, it's quite different. So in the north of Australia, Northern Territory, there's a huge area of land which is predominantly under Indigenous control, and they still maintain cultural practices. So burning is one of the big practices that's used in Australia, and we don't necessarily say that when we go out we're looking to maintain ecological sustainability. We talk about caring for country, and in that aspect we're saying we are looking after country because country looks after us. So country doesn't belong to us, but we belong to country, and one of our obligations and responsibility is to make sure that we can maintain and what is already there, but also not just for us, but for the rest of wildlife. So the burning of country is essentially the use of fire to manage species. So some species need smoke for the seeds to open, or they need some of the growth to burn off so that there's enough space for them to grow. There's also certain ways of cropping plants. So, I was taught as a child that you only ever take what you need. You never strip a bush entirely. And that's because, you also have to maintain that particular plant or the fruit or the seeds for the rest of the family. So the rest of the animals or insects who need to feed off it as well. I'm just trying to think of the other part of the question. Resource conservation. Yeah, I think for me the language is problematic. We wouldn't necessarily refer to them as a resource, although I use that term. And I think there's an ontological difference as well as an epistemological difference. We're not just looking at how to maintain it as a resource, we're looking at how to maintain it as part of our family. Yeah. And in doing so, we maintain ecological integrity.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for the answer. Moving on to Dr. Kaka. So, from the perspective of a social scientist, could you tell us a little about how community members are involved in resource management decisions?
You know, I'll take a cue from what Dr. Minter and Dr. Raven had said before. If you go back 20 years ago in India, there wasn't a lot of consciousness about people, about the Adivasis taking a pride in themselves. But now more and more, I'm seeing this through the help of cooperatives, through the help of cultural activities like poetry, songs, uh, now into films. The idea is that how can you generate a consciousness among the people, and to make sure that how can you ensure that people the idea that how can you mobilize people into through mass movements and all of that. And another thing that I want to sort of touch upon is that I, I have a problem with the term resource, because it's a very positivist economic term. The community does not necessarily look into what we have been taught as resources, but as something that is very sacred, be it minerals, be it plants, be it other things. So I think a lot of mobilization is happening on the ground through, mass movements, through poetry, through the idea of cooperatives, civil society coming in a huge way, and and now more and more with the with the advent of social media, you are really getting people to be aware. Of course, there is the aspect. There's of course that there's that one danger of a lot of fake news getting spread over. But then I think if we have a conscious civil society, I think that is one way where I see that you can generate a lot of awareness about the issues.
All right, thank you for your answer, sir. And it seems like we have reached the deadline of our time. To say it has been a delightful session would be an understatement. And I'm quite disappointed to say that with that, we come to an end to tonight's discussion. I thank each one of you for sharing your knowledge and valuable insights with us. I'm sure our audience had a wonderful time and have learned a lot, as well as have I. We are grateful to you all for taking out time from your busy schedules and for being a part of this discussion. It was an absolute pleasure to have been in your company this evening. This is
Thank you
also
so
a
much.
reminder that we are calling for submission on the cross culturalization of tribal communities, the details of which can be viewed on www.tellmeyourstory.biz. That's all for tonight. Good
Thank
night,
you so
everyone.
much.
Thank
It
you.
was
Thanks
it,
very
it
much.
was great hearing to everyone. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Good evening.
Good evening.
Bye.
See you later. Bye.